Hello and welcome again to our Civic Ecology course. The lecture today, lecture 4, is on systems inquiry. Systems inquiry is at the heart of civic ecology theory and application. The lecture today, as usual, will be divided in 3 episodes. On episode 1, we will talk about systems thinking. Episode 2, we're going to talk about complex adaptive systems, and finish the lecture with episode 3, an interview in which we will attempt to clarify some of the concepts and ideas discussed in the lecture. Episode 1, you are supposed to learn an emerging concept of social-ecological systems, the system's approach to understanding interconnection within and between systems, and the role of feedbacks on system dynamics. During episode 1, we will start by defining social-ecological systems and then move to some concepts related to systems thinking and then present our conclusions. We would like to start by saying that current human activities are changing the Earth's natural environment at rates and scales fundamentally different from those at any other time in history, as we discussed previously in lecture 2 when we look at planetary boundaries. In the words of American ecologist Professor Peter Witusek, we are changing Earth more rapidly than we are understanding it. Given the pervasive human presence on the planet, it has become impossible to understand nature without society as well as society without nature. Both the idea of a pristine nature as well as a denaturalized society are outdated, and the academic separation of the natural science from the humanities and social sciences poses a serious obstacle to solving our most urgent problems. Until the past few decades, the point of contact between the natural and social sciences was very limited in dealing with human and natural systems. Just as mainstream ecology had a little to say about human participation in ecosystem to the point of excluding humans totally from the study of ecology, many social science disciplines had totally ignored the environment and limited their scope to human systems only. In the last 2 decades, however, things have changed. Concerned scientists in different fields of research have come together to agree on a new perspective, a new description of the world we are living in. According to them, planet Earth is a self-organizing complex system in crisis. Secondly, humanity is an integral component in a powerful driver of planetary change. So the conclusion from this description, the new description of the Earth, is that the tightly coupled relations between humans and nature in a particular place constitute what scientists now call a social-ecological system. The term social-ecological system has been used to emphasize the integrated concept of humans in nature and to stress the delineation between social systems and ecological systems as artificial and arbitrary. Social-ecological systems studies have drawn heavily on systems thinking and complex theory, which are the 2 subjects of the lecture today. We're going to first discuss in episode 1 some concepts associated with systems thinking, and then in episode 2, we're going to have an opportunity to discuss some aspects associated with complexity theory. Systems thinking emerged more or less in the mid-20th century as an inquiry into the relationship between patterns and processes of organization in both natural and social systems. Austrian botanist Ludwig von Bartholomä is credited as one of the founders of general systems theory. Systems thinking is essentially an approach to integration that's based on the idea that the component parts of a system will behave differently when isolated from the system's environment or from the presence of other systems. Instead, in contrast to positivist and reductionist thinking, systems thinking sets out the view of systems in a holistic manner. The old saying, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. According to systems philosophy, the universe is organized into networks. These are nested systems, systems within systems within systems, with dynamic and reciprocal relationships expressing increasing holistic embrace and complexity. A system is a dynamic and complex entity composed of interdependent and interacting parts in an orderly manner. Every system shares a dual nature, as a whole unto itself, as a part of some greater system. One example that comes here to my mind to clarify this notion of nestedness and this dual nature of system. We can think of a cell as a part of tissues, which are parts of organs which together form organisms. So a cell is in itself a whole, but at the same time is a part of a larger whole, the tissue, what is in itself, again, a whole, but as a part of a larger whole, which is the organ. And these are nested one within each other all the way up from planet Earth, solar system, galaxy, universe, to all the way down to cells, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, etc. According to Hungarian systems philosopher Ervin Laszlo, everything in this systems framework, in this systems universe, is intertwined, interrelated, and in flux. Everything is continuously changing. One cannot understand the property of any part of this universe without understanding how this part is related to the others and how the others influence it. As you can see, this is a relational, holistic worldview of reality. Within this vision of systems philosophy, unique and novel qualities emerge through the evolution of increasingly complex patterns and processes. Rather than separate from matter in the Cartesian sense, mind is embedded in the natural processes that give rise to life as an emergent property. We're going to be talking more about emergent properties of complex systems in the second episode of our lecture. Consistent with systems philosophy, the field of systems thinking concerns an understanding of a system by examining the linkages and interactions between the elements that comprise the whole system. This perspective helps us to see the big picture, from which we can identify multiple leverage points that can be addressed to support constructive change. The importance of each component of a system is, in this way, tied to its relationship to the whole. By looking at just one component isolation, for example, looking at an atom, we would not have a realistic, more comprehensive picture of its importance within the context in which it unfolds. System thinking has been widely applied in both social and natural sciences. It helps us to explore interdependencies and looking at patterns, as well as understand the role of feedback mechanisms on the dynamics of systems over time. Has also helped us to conceptualize and calculate things like global carbon balance or a forest carbon budget, or even things like global hydrologic balance. The concept of nested systems is of interest and has particular relevance for conceptualizing sustainability. So I have these two figures here for you to look at, and the figure on the left is the nested systems view, and the figure on my left here, on your left, sorry, is the common way in which these three overlapping systems are presented: the ecological or environmental systems, the economic systems, and the social systems. I would like you to think about the impact of these two representation of sustainability on the concept of sustainability. Now, the adoption of system thinking entails making fundamental shifts of mind relative to our traditional way of thinking. I would like to briefly clarify some of the shifts, which with the purpose of clarifying or making or more explicitly describe the systems thinking approach. One of the important shifts in perception is the shift from the focus on parts to the focus on whole. As we said before, with any system, the whole is different from the sum of its individual parts. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And this, again, will be clarified in the second episode of the lecture, why the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. By shifting our focus from the parts to the whole, we can better grasp the connections between the different elements and the role they play within the context in which they emerge. Another important shift in perception is from focusing on objects to relationship. In the systems view, the objects of study are nothing else than networks of relationships. Relationships between individual parts may be more important than the parts themselves. An ecosystem is not a collection of objects, but including living things interacting with each other and the environment. And ecosystems, as we discussed in the previous lecture, plays an important role on human well-being, and in its proper functioning is essential for our own survival. Another important shift in perception is from a focus on structure to a focus on process. Living systems develop and evolve. Therefore, understanding the systems require a shift in focus from structural form to process, such as evolution, renewal, and change. Another shift is from context to pattern, and by this I mean within systems, certain configurations of relationships or patterns appear again and again, such as cycles and feedbacks, loops, and understanding how a pattern works in natural social system can help us understand other systems that manifest the same pattern. For example, understanding how flows of energy affect a natural ecosystem may help us to understand how flows of information affect, for instance, a social system. Another important shift in perception is from a focus on objective knowledge to contextual knowledge. Shifting focus from the parts to the whole implies shifting from analytical or objective thinking to contextual thinking. This shift encourages us to be facilitators and fellow learners rather than experts dispensing knowledge. Another important shift is from quantity to quality. Western science, as we well know, has been often focused on things that can be measured and quantified, to the extent that some early scientists expressed themselves saying that whatever cannot be quantified is not relevant, is not real. It has sometimes been implied that, as I said, that a phenomenon that cannot be measured and quantified does not exist at all. Some aspect of systems, for example, human systems, however, like the relationship in food web as well, cannot be measured. Rather, they must be mapped because they are patterns. One very important concept in the dynamics of systems, which make them behave most of the time on a nonlinear way, is the presence of feedback mechanisms. What is a feedback? When the output of a system is fed back into the system as part of its input, it's called the feedback. So you can imagine a given system like a box, and you have an input to that system, and then the system, a linear system, would have a direct response to that input, and that would be the output from the system. But if that output is fed back into the input, then we have what we call here a feedback. A feedback is both a mechanism, a process, and signal that is looped back to control a system from within itself. And this feeding back is called a feedback loop. Systems thinking, therefore, emphasizes circular feedback. For example, A leads to B, which leads to C, which leads back to A. And that's why it's so difficult to determine the primary causes of effects when dealing with living systems, with natural systems, because they are not linear. They don't have a clear cause and effect linear relationship. For instance, A leads to B, which leads to C, which leads to D. And from this perspective, when a linear perspective is adopted in a given research, the researchers always hope that starting with D, due to this linear chain, they can always go back to the causes, to A. There are two types of feedbacks, positive feedbacks and negative feedbacks. This notation has not to do with one feedback being good, the other feedback being bad. Actually, what they mean when somebody refers to a positive feedback is to a reinforcing mechanism. So a positive feedback is a reinforcing feedback. These reinforcing feedbacks tend to reinforce the direction of change, generates exponential growth or collapse. So there is a stimuli, an input to the system, and in the presence of a positive feedback, that input amplifies, causing exponential growth or even collapse of the system. On the other hand, a negative feedback is a balanced feedback, and it tends to reverse the direction of change, helps the system to maintain a stability. Examples of feedback mechanisms can be found in most complex systems that we're going to be exploring in the second episode, such as engineering, economics, thermodynamics, ecology, biology, and societies. I can give you an example why sometimes we are exposed to a bacteria or a virus, and sometimes we can get sick, sometimes we cannot. So the fact that we can get sick or not depends a lot on a complex dynamics within our immune system and the presence of positive or negative feedbacks. The expansion of an illness, the growth of a disease to a point of collapse is perhaps associated to the notion of positive or reinforcing feedback, as opposed to healing, okay, which would be probably associated with negative feedbacks into the immune system. I want to give you here two more examples to clarify, and this has to do with our global system. An example of a feedback mechanism on the left, a positive feedback mechanism on the left, and a negative feedback cycle on the right. Let's take a look at the positive feedback cycle. Let's assume that there is a slight increase in the surface temperature of the planet. So that slight increase in surface temperature will result in an increase in evaporation from the oceans. In turn, that increase in evaporation from the oceans will induce more water vapor in the atmosphere. And the presence of more water vapor into the atmosphere will enhance greenhouse effects. That means more heat is trapped within the atmosphere and is further increase surface temperature. So as you see, an input increase in surface temperature further promotes increase in surface temperature due to a positive feedback mechanism. On the other hand, the same surface temperature increase could also be, its dynamic could be controlled by a negative feedback cycle. Let's assume again that this slight surface temperature increase will increase evaporation from the oceans. But at this time, instead of contribute more water vapor into the atmosphere, we would have formation of low clouds in the atmosphere. So we have increased the formation of low clouds. So what the presence of those low clouds will do is to increase the reflectance power of the Earth, or what we call the Earth's albedo. And that means most of the incoming radiation will be reflected back to space. As a consequence, the surface temperature will decrease slightly. And that slight decrease in surface temperature will decrease evaporation from the oceans. So as you can see in the first mechanism, we have a increase in surface temperature associated with an initial increase. And in the second negative example of a negative feedback cycle, we have a decrease in surface temperature, which was associated with an initial slight increase in surface temperature. So the study of feedback mechanism is fascinating. There is a lot more to tell about it. Unfortunately, our time here is very short, and we have to stop here on this. In conclusion, systems thinking is a powerful way of understanding reality that emphasizes the relationship among a system's parts rather than the parts themselves. So that is a very a radical shift in thinking with respect to mainstream science, which, as we mentioned earlier, emphasize the emphasis on objects. But for system thinking, the performance, the dynamics, the pattern that comes out of a dynamic system is directly related to relationship among the different parts of the system. So a problem here with the reductionist approach of mainstream science is the focus when somebody goes to the system, take a part for detailed studies, and separate that part from the system. When that part is removed from the system, all the important relationships that characterize the dynamic of that system are lost. For example, if somebody wants to study a leaf, so a leaf has an important role to play into the context of the tree in interacting with some three parts and other leaves. However, when a scientist cuts the leaf and take the leaf to a lab and do a detailed chemical analysis of the leaf, he or she is actually studying something, but that even be called a leaf, but obviously is not the leaf as are understood within the context of the tree itself. Therefore, the system view of our human systems as operating within the larger Earth planetary system is crucial for attaining a sustainable relationship with the environment and assuring the continuous survival of our own species on the planet. In my view, exploring this way of thinking and applying it in determining our future is an opportunity which we cannot afford to miss. To conclude this episode, I would like you to explore this exercise through self-study. I would like first ask you to explain. I mentioned the lecture, but I didn't explore the details. I didn't explain this in detail. I would like you to explain, for example, in what aspects system thinkers differ from positivist and reductionist thinking. You already have a notion of what I mean by systems thinking. So therefore, if you do a little search and investigate what we mean by positivist and reductionist thinking, you will clearly see the difference between them. Secondly, I showed you a diagrammatic representation of sustainability from the traditional perspective and from a nested systems perspective. So I would like to ask you to describe the message that those two diagrammatic representation carry to you with respect to sustainability and sustainability strategies. And finally, I would like to ask, what does the system view of nature, which we describe here as part of what we call systems philosophy, can tell us about our place on Earth? Thank you very much. In the next episode, we will continue exploring this exceptional field of systems thinking, looking at a particular chapter, a particular aspect of systems thinking, which we call complex theory. More precisely, we're going to look at complex adaptive systems. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.